Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT show. This is your antidote to the BBC. And unlike the BBC, we do not have £300 million to squander every year. We try and get by with considerably less than that, probably about £3 per week. But thanks to you, the crowdfunder is growing a little bit each week, and I'd encourage you to, if you can, find a few pence somewhere in the back of a drawer or down the back of the sofa to send to Independence Live. Kevin, our producer tonight, does a remarkable job with very, very straitened circumstances. I mean, it really is a very difficult thing to do because he has a great range of shows. And I encourage you to take a look at many of those in addition, perhaps not at the same time, obviously, as the TNT show, because we want the biggest audience we can possibly get. But this is your place to come, I would suggest to you, because the show is live. It's every Wednesday, by and large, at 7:30. And we take the sort of guests that the BBC really wouldn't afford very much or even any time to, because their agenda does not fit your agenda. So since we're closer to your agenda than their agenda, they are, why don't you support us? Why don't you give us not just the benefit of the doubt by watching the show and being involved in the show, because again, unlike the BBC, we're live. We don't try to fix the thing by having Sarah Smith or some other person suggest to you something which they've dredged up from their subconscious, relying entirely upon facts, as we like to do here. So, without any further ado, let me just say to you that there are one or two things that I think you'll particularly like about tonight's show, because we have the former SNP policy advisor. And so we get a rare opportunity to speak to somebody who not only knows about the independence movement and its very extended vagaries, but also has actually been there as a candidate, as somebody working at the coal face. And that's always good to know about, because there's stuff that goes on behind the scenes sometimes, and it's good to get a sense of the complexities, because running a political party is not straightforward. It's not easy. And I know the cynics will say, oh, come on, John, it's the second oldest profession. You can't expect morality and ethics and all that. I do expect that. And I suspect our guest tonight feels the same. It's important. You seems to me in life, you've got two choices. You can either take the shortcuts, or you can seek to build and build and build until you eventually persuade enough people that the point of view that you espoused is something that they ought to find helpful and useful too. And then what happens is the movement becomes powerful and it becomes unstoppable eventually. And therefore, the very thing that you want to see happen becomes real. It ceases to be imaginary. It becomes actual. And I think that's commendable, but it has to be built up. And it requires tenacity, and it requires a lot of hard work. The folks on the other side don't need to work nearly as hard because they can rely upon all the organs of the state and their support. Which takes us right back to the BBC, of course. Anyway, enough of that. Let me right away introduce our guest for tonight, because we've got 60 minutes and we really ought to make the best of the time that we've got with him. His name is Toni Giugliano, and many or some of you may know of his previous life as the SNP policy convener, but he has a much more extensive portfolio even than that. So without any further ado, let's welcome Toni to the show. Toni, welcome. How are you?
Hi, John. Thanks so much for having me on tonight. Yeah, I'm good, thank you.
Good, excellent. Let's talk about what's happening in Scotland. As you look at the general picture in Scotland, what's your sense of it? Is the independence movement moving forward, backwards, sideways? Where do you think it's going?
I get the sense that politics right now is so polarised and fractured in many respects, and not just in Scotland. It's not a Scottish phenomenon. It's happening everywhere, and there's apathy. Apathy right now reigns supreme right across the UK, and I think for the independence movement, it's trying to channel the frustration that people are feeling, the anger, the apathy, into something positive. That's what I would like to see. I think that the Yes movement has a real role to play in turning that channeling that, harnessing that anger into something really positive. And I think there's real opportunities for us to do that. And for some time now, John, as you know, and independent supporters will know this as well from some of the columns I've written, that I've been calling for the re-establishment of a Yes campaign. And indeed, SNP Conference voted a couple of years ago to re-establish a Yes campaign, precisely to do what you said just a few moments ago, to create an unstoppable movement. I want to see support for independence well beyond 50%, because frankly, if we're talking about it, if we make it part of our everyday life, everyday discourse in terms of the policies, the issues that we're talking about, then independence should be much higher than it is at the moment. I think that we've got a lot of work to do to bring more people on side and to re-enthuse and re-energize, because frankly, I'm seeing a movement that needs to be lifted up again. That needs a sense of direction and that sense of purpose. And the thing about 2014 is that we demonstrated back then that we were bigger than any one party, right?
Yeah.
In pre-2014, looking at 2011, 2012, before that, the SNP was the only game in town as far as independence was concerned. But we had to demonstrate that we were more than one party. The opposition were forever in those years talking about, this is the SNP's dream, this is the SNP's pet project. They don't say that quite as much now, because during those years, we demonstrated that support for independence was everywhere, in every sector of Scottish society, from the trade unions to business and beyond. And I think that we need to keep that spirit alive. It's actually never been about one party. Independence is about Scotland. It's about all of Scotland, right across the political spectrum, actually. And so I feel that, yes, the SNP was central in supporting, in initiating and establishing that growth of what we now know as the independence movement. But the SNP also needs to know now that we are part of something bigger, and that movement, is here to stay.
I get the feeling, thanks for that, Tony. I get the feeling sometimes too, and certainly the folks who've been on the show have reiterated this, is that the SNP has become reactive. In other words, Westminster creates a problem, or perhaps in the most recent case, says the oddest things about the water supply in Scotland when it's being compared to that in England, where of course it's privatised and where it's become, whether the kindest way to call it is a complete
And
shambles.
tastes terrible, by the way, as well. I've lived in London, and this whole idea that
it's just awful. And I lived in Berkshire for 20 years, and I could see this sort of thing starting to happen. And most of the investment was creamed off when it was given to the shareholders, which is perfectly reasonable if your whole point was to create a private company. If your whole point was to improve water services, then it was a terrible mistake. So instead of saying, mea culpa, we made a mistake, a government minister took it upon himself to traduce the quality of water in Scotland. And then I looked to the SNP response, and again, it was the traditional, we deplore. I think, well, yeah, of course we deplore, but what are you going to do about it? I mean, here's somebody telling lies about a treasured element of the Scottish community.
Yeah.
I think most people think it demands more than deplore.
Yeah, totally. But I think it goes back to the fact that the SNP is a party of government, right? So naturally, on a day-to-day basis, there's a lot of reacting to be doing and firefighting, and effectively, the government side of things, special advisors will focus on that firefighting. The large part of the media, as you know, is not in our favour, and therefore there's a lot of that firefighting to be done, and rebuttal. But there's also the forward-looking piece, the strategy piece that I don't think gets done enough, and that's partly because resources are eaten up by being in government, uh, and having to constantly respond to things. And I think one of the things that we need to be doing is finding resource within the party and to an extent the government to be doing a lot more forward thinking, to be setting the agenda. We should be setting the political agenda. We should be setting the agenda we should be setting tomorrow's news. The majority of the time we're in government,
Yeah.
and yet we are constantly reacting to events, and I think that's where I think the shift needs to happen. And one of those areas that I've been talking about for quite some time is on EU membership. Let's talk about not just how awful Brexit is as it is, and we should be pointing out the failures of Brexit. Let's talk about what we would do as an independent Scotland in Europe. As an independent country, let's paint the picture of what kind of member state we would be.
Yeah.
Something that I don't think we've ever really done. Looking at the policy areas that we might explore, that we might be experts in, whether it's renewables or fisheries or life sciences or whatever it may be that we would be bringing to the table. Setting out that kind of ambition for, how might we lead a presidency of the European Council? That kind of,
Exactly.
if you want to be an independent country, you need to act like an independent country.
Precisely. And that's the lesson that every independent country has learned over the last thousands of years, frankly. So there's nothing new about that approach. But what's important about what you just said, it's a very effective approach. History has proven it time and time again. And also, here's a good example. You mentioned the hostile media. The media has been hostile for a very long time now. But if I want to see a rebuttal, I go to Twitter and I look at MSM Monitor. And what I get there is a very specific and precise and targeted response to what's appeared on the BBC and other channels. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, whoever MSM Monitor is, and they're welcome to come on the show, I get a sense, here's somebody sat down. They're not in government. They don't have resources, I assume, but they're doing it maybe in the back of an envelope. And I looked at the Scottish government and I say, if they can do it, how come you can't do it? There may well be a rebuttal, but I have to say it's with a very small R. Because I see material, and I'm sure many of the people watching tonight have had the same experience, where it's palpably false. A media outlet has said something which is palpably false, and then all you get is deplore. When I see on MSN Media, for example, is a video of the person who said it and what they said 2 months previously. That's a very powerful way of presentation. And if it can be done by somebody like that, or some group like that, I have to ask myself, why is it not happening generally across the board? After all, think about this. Well, it's true that broadcasting is reserved. And I gather that was put into the Scotland Act at the very last minute by Jack Straw, who was the Home Secretary, who was consulted by various groups, including the BBC, who were terrified that the BBC in Scotland would have to report to the Scottish people. And they managed to get that inserted into the Scotland Act. But that was a last minute thing. And what it did do is underscore the importance that the establishment attached to broadcasting. But okay, let's take it that for some reason, the Scottish government doesn't wish to in any way challenge the fact that broadcasting is reserved. There's lots of other ways to do it. I mean, take this programme tonight. I mean, for crying out loud, if we can do this with almost no resources, why isn't the Scottish government doing this? Why isn't there a Scottish minister on at 7:30, not 7:30 every Wednesday, but 7:30 every other day of the week, because we need to keep our audience. But I mean, why can't they do that? This is not rocket science. I mean, why can't they do it?
Yeah, and we need to get through to different audiences and different age groups, different demographics. When I was a candidate in previous elections, I focused a lot on digital, because there's there's a bit of a shift in the way that people are absorbing information, right? So we need to respond to that shift, and I think we need to be getting punchier messages out through videos, through different forms of digital, also looking at the ways in which different platforms are evolving, with a lot of people coming off X and onto other platforms. So we need to respond to that new digital reality of how people are absorbing information, and the fact that traditional mainstream media is now is not the only, and far from it now, source of information. So that's important.
I think it's very important, and I, when I talk to SNP activists, and I look at the material that they're producing in the constituencies that I used to be part of, a lot of it's based on leafleting. You have to go out and leaflet tonight. I think, I'm not sure that's the best approach, guys. I accept it's a good idea to have a leaflet. I question how many are actually read. I do wonder too about what impact they have, if any. And at the same time, one is not using the other channels that you've just outlined that could have a much more powerful impact. And I do worry about all of that, because it always seems to me that the SNP presents this sense of being stuck in the past, not moving on. Now, I'm not suggesting, by the way, that the opposition are a great deal better. They benefit enormously from the fact that they get
actually, you touched
easy
on
access.
something really important. You touched on something really important, and that's operational matters, because you win a campaign, right? Not just in terms of the messages. You win a campaign in terms of your actual operational performance, and that needs to work. And frankly, a lot of us who have been candidates, who have been activists for many years, know that some of our tools, campaign tools, are a little bit out of date. Some of us have been, campaigning internally for some time to have a bit of a refresher on some of those platforms, because we need to be able to compete with others who have outperformed us now in that space, and so we need to catch up, frankly. So I know there's some work going on in that respect, but I think we really need to make sure our operational work happens ahead. Our refresh happens ahead of the 26th election if we want to be match fit with other parties.
Here's a suggestion then to be match fit. I remember years and years ago campaigning for the SNP in a by-election, which was won by Labour. And I said to, I think it was the secretary of the party at the time, or anyway, somebody with an official capacity. And I said, are we doing an exit poll? What do you mean? I said, well, are we doing an exit poll? Well, we're probably not going to win this. I said, all the more point. Are we doing an exit poll? No, we can't afford that. I thought, oh, for crying out loud. You learn so much from failure. You can't avoid from time to time losing, but you should never lose the lesson. And the lesson is, if somebody hasn't voted for you, you absolutely have to know why not. And yet I see time after time, a whole bunch of pundits appear after a by-election or some election, most of them talking nonsense, I have to say, not based on facts, but based on sentiment. And that gets you absolutely nowhere. And it also encourages people to be defensive instead of owning up and saying we need to do better here, there, and there. There's a lot of defensive nonsense about, well, maybe our candidate should have been X rather than Y. You think, oh, for crying out loud, you ought to know categorically what the problem was. And if you don't know what the problem was, you can't fix it.
And I think, to be fair, I think it was reported recently that the SNP did a couple of focus groups recently around some central belt constituencies, where they were looking to find out exactly that. I think it may have been just after the Hamilton by-election or just before. But it has to. You're right. There has to be an analysis of where we get things right, where we get things wrong, and arguably, maybe should have been a deeper analysis of where we could have done better in 2014. And I know that many activists have, for a long time, asked for that kind of much deeper analysis of what went wrong there. I mean, in many respects, I think it was an extraordinary campaign because we managed to shift from 29% of the polls to 45%. I still think that at one point, not some days before the referendum, we were probably ahead, and you'll remember that opinion poll that came out just before the referendum. So I think on the whole, we ran a much better campaign than Better Together, but I think it would have been the right thing to do to analyse that campaign, to analyse exactly what we should have done next. But this is the nature of political parties; they're constantly moving on to the next thing. There's very little time to reflect and digest and ask the right questions. You're constantly moving on, and this is what I'm talking about, the whole firefighting nature of political parties. There has to be some degree of forward-looking planning, of strategy, and sadly, that's lacking and has been lacking for some time. I don't think that the SNP is the only party in that respect. I think that,
not at all.
All political parties.
They all do it. They all do it. But the cliche applies here. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail, and that's a fact. It's a fact in business. I mean, anyone who's in business knows that you have to have a strategy and a plan. You have to have a clear set of values, you need a strategy and a plan, and you need to put in a program in order to execute that plan. And you keep checking every single time that you can. You go back to the customer and say, did I get it right? Is there anything I can change? Is it the color? Is it what? You're constantly doing it. That's what the successful businesses do so remarkably well, and the unsuccessful ones fail to do because they don't appreciate the customer. And I sometimes get that impression about the SNP. It takes a lot of its customer for granted.
And this is what we can't afford to do, especially looking ahead to the 26th election. But I was just going to say, when you were talking about leafleting and digital, I think that the two most effective things are speaking to people face to face, and the short and crisp and effective messages that they get on social media. Those are, in my opinion, I think leafleting has a place to an extent, but I think there's nothing that beats conversations with people. And that goes back to your point about following things up. If someone says to me, I'm tapping on a door and someone has, a problem with, they can't get a ramp outside their front door, they've got a problem with the local authority. This is the kind of thing, you need to follow up. And work in tandem with different levels of government, council, Holyrood, Westminster, to be able to do that. And there's nothing more effective than being able to speak to people face to face, because it builds trust.
Yeah.
And it's not there's a difference between transactional relationships and much deeper relationships. And if you can demonstrate that you're not just there to get their vote, that actually you care about the community, that you're communicating regularly, maybe you're putting out regular newsletters in the community, and that's something that there are some political parties that are actually better than the SNP at doing that in some areas, and I think that we need to get better at that as well, building a relationship not just at election time, making sure we have communication throughout the year, because that's the kind of relationship building that you need to then also, when you're coming round to talk about independence or to talk about election time, you're the guy that,
I think you make a good point, but my experience has always been, and it may be flawed, but I hope it's not after all these years, going back to Gerskaden, which I vaguely didn't actually mention but referred to earlier. On the doorsteps is great, but once you're in government, that needs to be fully supported by the government, and because there's some things that activists can't do on the doorstep. And when somebody's just been watching the BBC, and the BBC has suggested that the Scottish government, and the SNP in particular, is failing in so many respects, there should be somebody in the Scottish government who's immediately, and with the technologies all here, is able to communicate to right across the board, saying that what was transmitted 5 minutes ago is wrong in the following respects. So if you're asked by anyone, these are the answers you ought to give. It goes right to your phone. I mean, this is not rocket science. It goes right to your phone, and immediately the guy on the doorstep is able to say to the prospective voter, this is the reality. And if that happens enough time, people will lose confidence in mass media because you develop a trust. It's much easier to develop trust face to face, as you said,
Absolutely.
than it is
100%.
remotely. So
100%.
this is the big downside of mass media. It cannot contest and challenge somebody who has the facts at their disposal and is talking to them face to face. They will lose that competition. And that means that the individual on the doorstep needs to be fully empowered with the data in order to properly respond. And that will create a knock-on effect, because that person that they're talking to goes to work and said, yeah, that's true, that was on the BBC last night.
Yeah,
Actually, the
yeah.
facts are it's this, and this.
Totally.
That's it.
When I was policy development convener for a couple of years, I set up what were known as the independence seminars. We did a few of those. They didn't go down too well in all quarters of the party, let's say, but the party members, the ordinary members, very much loved them. And it was an initiative that I came up with because I felt, I have to do something with, in addition to the actual role, I felt, to try and move the debate on with independence. I tried to find as many, I used the platform as much as I could to come up with some new ways of discussing independence even internally. And the purpose of it was to equip, as you say, equip the activists with the information that they needed on key issues, right? EU accession, currency, the border, sort of the economy in an independent Scotland. So the pensions, the big issues that people wanted to know more on before, being convinced either way on independence. And that resulted in hundreds of members turning up to these seminars, getting some of the information that they needed. It was then translated into, handouts for activists to go out on. And that's the sort of thing that I think we need to be doing more of, giving our own activists the confidence to be able to go out there and discuss the issues of independence. And frankly, and I've said this now for a long time, that since the referendum, we should have been doing more, not just at a party level, but at a sort of movement level, to address the issues that remain unaddressed on independence policy, like the ones that I've just mentioned. On all of these, in my view, we will win handsomely when I can knock on someone's door and they can tell me what the position is on currency and on the border and on EU accession. When we have informed the electorate, and the electorate is clear, crystal clear, and has the confidence to say, yeah, this is what will happen, this is what we'll do. It's not going to be perfect, but on day one, this is what it's going to look like. And I think this is the assurance. And I get the fact that we can't prescribe everything, right? That we can't set everything in stone, because that's impossible to do. But what we can do is give people a little bit more certainty on the key issues that matter to them. And I still think that there's a lot more to be done on that. And that's why
I agree totally.
This campaign.
I think that's the rebuttal thing ought to be on phones. It ought to be immediate. There should be somebody working 24/7 who supplies the activist with absolutely up-to-date information. So whether they're out campaigning or talking to somebody in the pub, all they have to do is open the app and it says, whatever you saw last night or 5 minutes ago is wrong in these respects. This is the reality. Bingo, simple as that. But also we need to be looking forward, as you say. I mean, Alex Adam made a good point. He says, something, we should stop firefighting and start setting fires. And I think what he means by that is not just put some fire in the belly of the activists, but actually the government should be proactive. and it should not be waiting there to react to some Westminster initiative, which makes absolutely no sense. Because that attitude, if it's allowed to become deeply established, produces the same attitude in the electorate. If they see you as reactive, they'll go for someone who claims to be proactive. And that's why reform, I would suggest, is picking up a bunch of votes or sympathisers, for the simple reason that they do not accept the status quo. They say we have a better alternative, and this is what we're going to do. It's mostly nonsense. It's mostly nonsense. But the reality is they're being proactive. And therefore, but through being proactive, they are attractive.
Yeah.
Now, the fact that it's baseless.
But there's also something about communication style, right? Because the way that we are communicating, I think that there's something about giving people that confidence and that that people are craving at the moment. That kind of perfectionism that we seen in the 2010s with Nick Clegg, Tony Blair, that sort of perfecting style interview, that's out and authenticity is in.
Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't matter where in Europe or in the West, whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's Giorgia Meloni or Nigel Farage. I can't stand any of these three people. But the reality is, right, rightly or wrongly, they get through to people. And I will never, espouse to their policies and what they stand for. But in terms of communicating, in terms of the authenticity, people want more of that. People want politicians to speak their language, like in absolute clarity. And I think that's also an issue right now. I think we need to connect with people. The ability to connect is so important. And sometimes the ability to connect can sometimes be even as important as the message itself.
Well, I learned at a very early stage in business that the key was not information, it was communication. And communication is two-way. And very often when I see political parties, the biggest mistake they make is to assume they're in the information business and not in the communication business. They seem to believe that once they're in a position of power, they don't have to be receptive. And they get a very bad reputation as a result. But first of all, before going any further, I need to issue an apology. I described Alex Adam as male. I apologise, Alex. That's a mistake on my part. And you're right to pick me up on it. There's every reason why Alex could be female. And I'm afraid it's a mistake I made. And my sincerest apologies. I hope it hasn't put you off the programme. But as I was saying, it's important to be proactive. Can we just talk a little bit about you were a candidate for Falkirk West, just to change things a little bit, and there was some difficulty there. Tony, are you in a position to talk about that, or is that something you prefer not to talk about?
I'm very limited in what I can say, John. I'm very limited in what I can say at the moment. It is an ongoing, situation, and I think I issued a statement soon after my appeal was won. I won, as I say, unanimously. The appeals committee dismissed a complaint against me. I was removed from the ballot in Falkirk West with a couple of days to go before the polls closed. And I said at the time, that I was suspended and removed from the ballot, that decision was procedurally flawed. And the committee's report was clear that I was denied a fair hearing. So that's the situation that I'm in. I'm delighted that I was cleared fully unanimously by the appeals committee, and it's a full vindication for the SNP members who voted for me and who stood by me. And I'm now in a sort of consultation with the party about what comes next. And this is not the end of the process. It's the start of figuring out what comes next, and that's something that I'm hoping that we can conclude in the coming days. But that's as much as I'm able to say on that.
Okay. Okay.
The only other thing that I would add, however, is the importance of democracy in any political party, because it is vital that the members of any political party have their say and that their voices are respected. Without membership, without our members, we are nothing as a political party.
Yeah.
And therefore, I hope that ultimately that our members' voices will prevail.
Okay. There's two things I take from that in summary. One is that you've been vindicated, and secondly, you still have a strong interest in standing and supporting the SNP. Is that right?
Well, look, I want the SNP to succeed. Yeah,
Yeah.
I want the SNP to succeed, and I want the SNP to succeed in the upcoming election. And I know we'll talk a bit more about the election, I suppose, in the next part of your interview, I'm guessing. But yeah, I mean, I think the SNP will succeed if we're able to put independence front and centre
Yeah.
of this election.
But before we move on to that, just talking about you again for a second, just to complete that, so we all understand.
Sure.
You'd be happy to be a candidate.
Well, the regional list hasn't been established yet, and I will discuss with the party the options for potentially going forward for that, and we'll see what the next few weeks bring.
So these missteps haven't put you off completely. That you're still active and you still want to be there in the forefront.
I believe in independence, and I believe that my party, that I've been a member of for the good part of 20 years, is a lot better than what happened in that situation.
Yeah.
I believe that the vast majority of our members are a lot better than that, and
Yeah.
I will be as active as I've ever been. In fact, I'll tell you more. It has, if anything, this whole situation encouraged me to roll up my sleeves and get stuck back in.
Good. Excellent. That's very good news. Thanks for that. I hope you don't mind, but I thought it was important to address that because these things are important. I mean, I want to ask you your thoughts on this. This is a motion that, according to social media, that the Newington branch has submitted for the annual conference of the SNP in October. It says this motion asks conference to agree, firstly, that seeking a Section 30 order from the UK government to hold a referendum on Scotland's constitutional future undermines Scotland's sovereignty and its right to decide. And secondly, that sovereignty lies with the Scottish people, not Westminster. And the final paragraph reads, therefore, conference agrees that the SNP shall put in their manifesto for the 2026 Scottish Parliament election that if a majority of SNP and other pro-independence FSPs are returned to Holyrood in 2026, they will bring forward a bill to assume responsibility for all constitutional affairs as directed by the people of Scotland. This includes the right to hold referendums on increased powers and independence. Is that something that you feel is appropriate or helpful? What's your take on that, Tony?
My take on it as a former policy convener of the party is that party members decide policy, and the party leadership, of course, have every right to put forward their proposal, but their proposal is not party policy until it has been voted by conference.
Okay.
I've seen. It's interesting to hear from Newington branch. I've seen a number of resolutions coming from branches all over Scotland, and that is heartening because actually this is about party democracy, and we need to have a full discussion about what our strategy looks like. And I think that conference will actually be very lively this year in that respect. And you know, if the SNP values debate and democracy, then it will value the contributions of its members and its branches across Scotland. So I want to see a full debate. We should absolutely debate the proposal that's come forward from leadership of the party, but equally we need to hear from the different proposals. And I've seen, as I say, quite a lot of different proposals. So I'm not going to commit myself to one or the other because there's a lot that's come in, and I know that there's meetings and all sorts of discussions happening behind the scenes right now ahead of conference to look at the different motions that have come from the different branches, with a view to ensuring that we have a solid resolution before the party that can be adopted on independent strategy ahead of 2026. Now, my view is that it's really difficult to go back to a 2011 kind of scenario pre-referendum when we now have an established yes movement, right? So when we talk about let's look at the I'll maybe set out four key points, and then your viewers, your listeners can make their own minds up. I suspect they've probably made their own minds up already. The first point is the SNP has only won a majority once, right? So the SNP's election winning machine, Nicola Sturgeon, never won a majority. Not in 2016, not in 2021. So and those were the good years, right? Including when Nicola was guiding us through COVID. So we still fell short. That's the first consideration. Second consideration, 2011 was, as I say, pre-referendum and therefore pre-grassroots movement. We now have a support base of around 50%. And that support base can distinguish between supporting the SNP and supporting independents. We've seen that in the general election last year, right? Third point, we have a more fractured and polarised political landscape now than we had in 2011, exacerbated by the rise of reform, which is eating into every party's votes, by the way, including ours. Seen that in Hamilton. And last point I would make is that voter priorities have shifted. So in 2011, there was a bit more optimism in terms of, really competent government after 4 years. We were only in government for those 4 years with Alex Salmond. And we won the majority in the back of that really competent government. The more you go on in government, the more baggage you carry, right? In 2026, we'll be 20 years in government. And so we must contend with disillusionment, fatigue, cost of living pressures, and all the rest of it. So these are big issues to digest if you're then looking at saying that the only way in which independence will progress is if we win a majority single-handedly without any other party. This is a matter for debate. It's a matter for conference to debate.
I think people are confused about that, Tony. I mean, somebody called me earlier and said, can you explain this conundrum to me? The SNP are saying a majority of independence MPs is not enough, but a majority of SNP MPs is. What does that mean? It seems entirely counterproductive.
As I say, I think the political landscape of 2011 no longer exists, John. We're in a totally different territory, and I think that we need a political strategy for 2026, not 2011. So that's my assessment of this. But look, I'm going to take more time to digest that, hear a bit more about what arguments leadership are going to come forward with. But I'm also going to listen to the members who are saying that actually 2026 should be much clearly a referendum on independence and how we go about making the case. But I go back to what I was saying earlier. To increase support for independence, you need to build a campaign that boosts support for independence. You need to talk about independence. You can't expect to win a majority on independence without independence being front and centre. And the reality is that the resolution of 2023 that was backed by conference has not been implemented. There has not been a yes campaign formed in the way that was stipulated and voted on by members in 2023. And I think that is, as a priority, what we should be doing as a yes movement, collectively as a yes movement, recognising that there's no one single party that holds a majority of wisdom on independence.
Sure.
There are people who are attracted to a greener version of independence. There are people, frankly, in Alba who are attracted to a different kind of independence, people who perhaps don't want to be in the European Union, right? I have these debates all the time with people who say to me, what are you doing, arguing for EU membership, we should be part of EFTA, EE and all the rest of it. I disagree with that view, but you know what? There are people out there who support it.
Exactly.
And therefore, so
Don't you think there's some real value though in what I gather is being suggested, somewhat late in the day, because we discussed this with Stephen Flynn over a year ago, I think now, about having a constitutional convention, and at that time we were told that the SNP were certainly doing this. It was being planned, and I asked Stephen to please forward the name of the person who was doing the planning. I waited 6 months and we never heard from him again. And therefore I assumed it had been put on the back burner. But it seems to me that if we have and I gather now the SNP policy is to have an immediate constitutional convention. And I assume that would address at least some of the points you just made.
Yeah, and that's welcome. That's highly welcome. I mean, I've been calling for that for some time, and a lot of figures within the SNP and the wider Yes movement have been calling for that convention to be taking place. That is positive, precisely because we need to acknowledge that we need to come together. And what was 2014 about? 2014 was about unity. It was about showing that we had support across the length and breadth of Scotland, as I said earlier, across different sectors and across different political parties as well. So we need to try and recreate that hope and that optimism. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what this is about. I want the SNP to succeed. I want independence to succeed by talking about the benefits of independence day in, day out. The SNP wins when we focus on what independence can deliver. Cheaper energy bills, because Scotland's renewables should benefit us, not Westminster. Powers to tackle the cost of living.
I'd like to suggest to you that there is
make housing more affordable.
I agree with all of that. But for me, there was a major flaw in the Yes campaign. And the major flaw was that the opposition were resolutely negative. In other words, if you vote yes, then your granny will lose her pension. If you vote yes, we'll be thrown out of the EU. It was resolutely negative, and it was failing. And that the difficulty was that the Yes campaign was resolutely positive. And while I applaud that, I did point out to the leader of the Yes campaign, you can't be a one-club golfer. You have to have some negative clubs in your bag, because they will use negative all the time, and there'll come a time where you'll desperately need it. And that's exactly what happened. 1 week before the election, there was a positive Yes poll, and what they immediately did was to break all the rules by introducing a third option. That third option appeared attractive to many people, just enough, because the Yes campaign had not been sufficiently negative to warn people about the consequences of a no vote. And the result then was that a number of people shifted out of Yes into the middle, and the referendum was lost. It's awfully important, and no one likes this, but the reality is you have to go negative. You have to have some stuff that responds. For example, if they say, your water company is terrible and it's all lies, you don't just refute that, but you actually go and talk about the water companies south of the border, and you point out the flaws and all that sort of stuff. And my suggestion is that you have to do both. You have to do both. I mean, Dave Burkett is saying negative campaigns. The reason that negative campaigns work is because they depend almost entirely upon the character of the electorate. If the electorate has been taught and told that they don't amount to very much, then negative campaigns have an overwhelming influence on their outcomes. But you need to have some negativity in the system. And when I look at the SNP campaigns, they're still resolutely positive and don't ever assign problems to the opposition, as it were. And there's plenty of opportunity to do so.
You need to do both. You absolutely need to do
Exactly.
both. The challenge is that we, as a party of, and this is the thing, John, as a party of government, we obviously need to talk about the things that we've done in government over the past 20 years, right? So we need to talk about the policy landscape, the things that whether it's free tuition and free prescriptions, whether it's the expansion of childcare. These are things that we've done that are different to what's happening in England. So there has to be an element of that. There has to be an element of looking at what an independent Scotland will look like, the difference between what we have now and what we can reimagine as a new country. Because otherwise, what's the point, right? If we're so we have to look ahead, and we have to paint a picture and let people see, as I was saying earlier, about thinking like a state, acting like a state. That's the sort of narratives that we need. But equally, I agree with you that we need to be painting the flaws of the Westminster system, but also tapping into people's feelings as well, because emotional campaigns have a really, really strong impact.
And also, we have it's easy for me to sit here and make these pontifications, but the reality is, I would strongly suggest the SNP took a very hard look at what happened in the United States and the re-emergence of Donald Trump. Almost all of that was predicated upon an extremely close working relationship between the Trump campaign and Facebook, and which the Trump campaign was embedded in the Facebook team. And they organized to send out messages on social media to individuals that were tailored specifically to individuals.
You're preaching you're preaching to the converted. I was the SNP candidate in the general election last year that I believe spent the most of all SNP candidates on digital. Not that it made an impact overall in the results, sadly, because it was what it was, that particular election. But I understand the need to connect with people. The amount of people that said to me, I seen your video, coming up in my feed, I agreed with it, but I want the Tories out. So, I mean, ultimately in that election, we were up against it because people wanted to get rid of the Tories, and there was just no way for us to compete in that regard, which is why it was a real mistake, to circle back to the point about strategy. Like, it was such a big mistake to set ourselves a target when, as a party, we were at our lowest point. 3 leaders in one parliamentary term. We had a police investigation. We had a ton of, we had the iPad gate, which was massive. All sorts of stuff that sadly was not in our favour, and yet we came up with a strategy, that was totally out of reach. And what I would want to say this time again is, don't build a strategy for an election that is totally out of reach, because that's not going to advance independence, right? That will do the opposite, and that's my concern. And one that I would air at SNP conference. And I think we need to find a strategy that mobilises our vote base, because ultimately that's what this is about, right? Mobilising our vote base and talking about independence so that we can secure a pro-independence majority, or whether it's SNP or with other political parties. But we need to do it in such a way that is galvanising. We need to do it in such a way that doesn't harm us, because we're setting ourselves a target that is unattainable. And that is my biggest concern right now.
Someone much smarter than me said that politics is the art of the possible. It seems to me that's a useful dictum to bear in mind, which helps you to set realistic targets. It also helps you to understand why it's crucially important to be in constant communication with people. And I don't mean information again. You need to encourage people to come back to you. And even though when they come back to you and say things you don't like, that's hugely important, because that's the only way you progress, is to listen to people who are saying things you don't like, because out of that comes the kernel of how to reach out and mobilize a great mass of people, because you've then taken on board a range of elements. And again, out of that, there's a lesson in there. And if people are hugely negative, what is the kernel of that? What motivates that negativity? And I don't see any research. I mean, for a while, we ran a number of programs because of my column in the Sunday National on the Constitution. And we invited the Constitution Minister on the show. And he said, well, it's not something I really want to do. And that struck me as an appalling answer. An appalling answer. What did that mean? You're the Constitution Minister. We're talking to activists and people across the board about the Constitution, and you don't want to give your say? You don't want to have your say? I mean, it speaks to insularity, which is the very opposite of what we've been talking about.
And that's it. And I think that, as I say, we have a real opportunity over the next couple of months to come together as a party, then come together as a movement. And I've been saying for quite some time, the movement needs to be united. We will win independence when we're united again, as we were in 2014. And when we give Scotland the confidence and the answers that they need to make an informed decision. That's what I think we need to be doing between now and the Holyrood election. Give people confidence, build the platform, build the foundations that we need as a party and as a movement to raise Scotland's self-confidence, because fundamentally, that is the biggest challenge that we have, is confidence. Scotland believing in itself. Scotland should believe in itself. We should be illustrating the talent, the resources that we have, the wealth and the opportunities that we have in our country to build a much fairer Scotland as an independent country in Europe. And I think that we have the opportunity to do that if we put our mind to it, if we choose to focus on that as a party and as a movement, put the personalities as much as possible to one side, and think about the cause. Think about the cause, put the cause first. I'm not interested in a strategy that is about prolonging devolution. I'm interested in a strategy that delivers independence.
Yeah. And I think, frankly, that's what people want. And I think they became disillusioned at the last general election because they didn't think that was going to happen for them. And that, because the Labour Party has failed so abominably, it means that it's opened up a marvellous opportunity for the SNP and, of course, for others like Reform. But the reality is that a leadership that was proactive would do much to stimulate and reach out to activists. It would, the negativity tends to happen because the leadership have not taken the steps, simple steps, to address that. And the way you address it is through positivity. You every time there's a negative comment, you match it with a positive one. It's not difficult. It is not difficult. The data's all there. It's a lack of the will to do it and do it consistently and use the technology that's available now, which wasn't available at previous times. None of this is rocket science. You know, a couple of guys in a back room could do all of that I've just been talking about. In fact, MSM Monitor does it every single day and sometimes several times a day. So this is not difficult. You know, now, and we're talking about a government, for crying out loud. How many civil servants do they have? What are these guys doing and girls doing? I don't know. I never hear from them. I never see anything positive. And nothing. Zero. So it seems to me there's a lot to be done. And all power to your arm, Tony. I'm sure if anyone's going to bring about that change that's necessary, it's going to be people like you, I have to say.
Well, there has to be perseverance, you know, and, you know, there are people that, not just with this, but with anything, you know, if they don't get something first time round, they move on to the next thing. I think if you believe in something, truly believe in something, then you roll up your sleeves, you get back on the horse and you keep fighting.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So
and you protect
that's what I've done within the Yes movement and the independence cause for many years, and that's what I'll continue to do.
Good luck to you. And thank you very much for being our guest tonight. As I said, that the hour would go very fast. It has. We've run out of time. We've got about 3 seconds left. Just enough time to say thank you very much, Tony.
Thanks again, John.
I wish you every success. And if you have anything else to talk to us about, do give us a call. I'd like to continue this chat. Thank you to all of you for watching tonight. Apologies again, Alex. I'll get that right next time. Good night. See you all next week at 7:30. Take care, stay safe, and look after each other. Good night.